The Englishman was sitting on a bench in a structure that smelled of animals, sweat, and dust. It was part warehouse, part coral. I never thought I would end up in a place like this, he thought, as he leafed through the pages of a chemical journal. 10 years at the university, and here I am in a coral. But he had to move on. He believed in omens all his life, and all his studies were aimed at finding the one true language of the universe. First, he had studied Esperanto, then the world's religions, and now it was alchemy. He knew how to speak Esperanto. He understood all the major religions well, but he wasn't yet an alchemist. He had unraveled the truths behind important questions, but his studies had taken him to a point beyond which he could not seem to go. He had tried in vain to establish a relationship with an alchemist, but the alchemists were strange people who thought only about themselves and almost always refused to help him. Who knows? Maybe they had failed to discover the secret of the master work, the philosopher's stone, and for this reason kept their knowledge to themselves. He had already spent much of the fortune left to him by his father, fruitlessly seeking the philosopher's stone. He had spent enormous amounts of time at the great libraries of the world and had purchased all the rarest and most important volumes on alchemy. In one, he had read that many years ago a famous Arabian alchemist had visited Europe. It was said that he was more than 200 years old and that he had discovered the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. The Englishman had been profoundly impressed by the story, but he would never have thought it more than just a myth. Had not a friend of his, returning from an archaeological expedition in the desert, told him about an Arab that was possessed of exceptional powers. He lives at the Alfam Oasis, his friend had said, and people say that he is 200 years old and is able to transform any metal into gold. The Englishman could not contain his excitement. He cancelled all his commitment and pulled together the most important of his books. And now here he was, sitting inside a dusty, smelly warehouse. Outside, a huge caravan was being prepared for crossing the Sahara Desert and was scheduled to pass through Al Fayum. I'm going to find that damn chemist, the Englishman thought, and the odor of the animals became a bit more tolerable. A young Arab, also loaded down with baggage, entered and greeted the Englishman. Where are you bound? Asked the young Arab. I am going into the desert, the man answered, turning back to his reading. He didn't want any conversation at this point. What he needed to do was review all he had learned over the years, because the alchemist would certainly put him to the test. The young Arab took out a book and began to read. The book was written in Spanish. That's good, thought the Englishman. He spoke Spanish better than Arabic. And if this boy was going to Alfayum, there would be someone to talk to when there were no other important things to do. That's strange, said the boy, as he tried once again to read the burial scene that began the book. I have been trying for 2 years to read this book, and I never get past these first few pages, even without a king to provide an interruption. He was unable to concentrate. He still had some doubts about the decision he had made, but he was able to understand one thing. Making a decision was only the beginning of things. When someone makes a decision, he's really diving into a strong current that will carry him to places he had never dreamed of when he first made the decision. When I decided to seek out my treasure, I never imagined that I would end up working in a crystal shop, he thought, and joining this caravan may have been my decision, but where it goes is going to be a mystery to me. Nearby was the Englishman, reading a book. He seemed unfriendly and had looked irritated when the boy had entered. They might even have become friends, but the Englishman closed off the conversation. The boy closed his book. He felt that he didn't want to do anything that might make him look like the Englishman. He took Urim and Thummim from his pocket and began playing with them. The stranger shouted. Urim and Thummim? In a flash, the boy put them back in his pocket. They are not for sale, he said. They are not worth much, the Englishman answered. They are only made of rock crystal, and there are millions of rock crystals in the earth. But those who know about such things would know that those are Urim and Thummim. I didn't know that they had them in this part of the world. They were given to me as a present by a king, the boy said. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he put his hand in his pocket and took out two stones that were the same as the boy's. Did you see a king? He asked. I guess you don't believe that a king would talk to someone like me, a shepherd, he said, wanting to end the conversation. Not at all. It was shepherds who were the first to recognize a king that the rest of the world refused to acknowledge. So it's not surprising that kings would talk to shepherds. And he went on, fearing that the boy wouldn't understand what he was talking about. It's in the Bible, the same book that taught me about Urim and Thummim. These stones were the only form of divination permitted by God. The priest carried them in a golden breastplate. The boy was suddenly happy to be there at the warehouse. Maybe this is an omen, said the Englishman, half aloud. Why told you about omens? Who told you about omens? The boy's interest was increased by the moment. Everything in life is an omen, said the Englishman. Now closing the journal he was reading. There is a universal language, understood by everybody, but already forgotten. I am in search of that universal language, among other things. That's why I am here. I have to find a man who knows that universal language, an alchemist. The conversation was interrupted by the warehouse boss. You are in luck, due to the fat Arab said. There is a caravan leaving today for Al Fayoum. But I'm going to Egypt, the boy said. Al Fayoum is in Egypt, said the Arab. What kind of Arab are you? That's a good luck omen, the Englishman said, after the fat Arab had gone out. If I could, I would write a huge encyclopedia just about the words luck and coincidence. It's with those words that the universal language is written. He told the boy it was no coincidence that he had met him with Joram and Thummim in his hand, and he asked the boy if he too were in search of the alchemist. I'm looking for a treasure, said the boy, and he immediately regretted having said it. But the Englishman appeared not to attach any importance to it. In a way, so am I, he said. I don't even know what alchemy is, the boy was saying, when the warehouse boss called to them to come outside. I am the leader of the caravan, said a dark eyed, bearded man. I hold the power of life and death for every person I take with me. The desert is a capricious lady, and sometimes she drives men crazy. There were almost 200 people gathered there, and 400 animals camels, horses, mules, and fowl. In the crowd were women, children, and a number of men with swords at their belts and rifles slung on their shoulders. The Englishman had several suitcases filled with books. There was a babel of noise, and the leader had to repeat himself several times for everyone to understand what he was saying. There are a lot of different people here, and each has his own God. But the only God I serve is Allah, and in His name I swear that I will do everything possible once again to win out over the desert. But I want each and every one of you to swear by the God you believe in, that you will follow my orders no matter what. In the desert, disobedience means death. There was a murmur from the crowd. Each was swearing quietly to his or her own God. The boy swore to Jesus Christ. The Englishman said nothing, and the murmur lasted longer than a simple war would have. The people were also praying to heaven for protection. A long note was sounded on a bell, and everyone mounted up. The boy and the Englishman had bought camels and climbed uncertainly onto their backs. The boy felt sorry for the Englishman's camel, loaded down as he was with the cases of books. There is no such thing as coincidence, said the Englishman, picking up the conversation where it had been interrupted in the warehouse. I am here because a friend of mine heard of an Arab who. But the caravan began to move, and it was impossible to hear what the Englishman was saying. The boy knew what he was about to describe, the mysterious chain that links one thing to another, the same chain that had caused him to become a shepherd, that had caused his recurring dream, that had brought him to a city near Africa to find a king and to be robbed in order to meet a crystal merchant. And the closer one gets to realizing his destiny, the more the destiny becomes his true reason for being, thought the boy. The caravan moved toward the east. It traveled during the morning, halted when the sun was at its strongest, and resumed late in the afternoon. The boy spoke very little with the Englishman, who spent most of his time with his books. The boy observed in silence the progress of the animals and people across the desert. Now everything was quite different from how it was that day they had set out. Then there had been confusion and shouting, the cries of children and the whining of animals, all mixed with the nervous orders of the guides and merchants. But in the desert, there was only the sound of the eternal wind and of the hoofbeats of the animals. Even the guides spoke very little to one another. I have crossed these sands many times, said one of the camel drivers one night. But the desert is so huge and the horizon so distant that they make a person feel small and as if he should remain silent. The boy understood intuitively what he meant, even without ever having set foot in the desert before. Whenever he saw the sea or a fire, he felt silent, impressed by their elemental force. I have learned things from the sheep and I have learned things from crystal, he thought. I can learn something from the desert too. It seems old and wise. The wind never stopped, and the boy remembered the day he had sat in the fort in Tarifa with the same wind blowing in his face. It reminded him of the wool from his sheep who were now seeking food and water in the fields of Indonesia, as they always had. They are not my sheep anymore, he said to himself, without nostalgia. They must be used to their new shepherd and have probably already forgotten me. That's good. Creatures like the sheep that are used to traveling know about moving on. He thought of the merchant's daughter and was sure that she had probably married, perhaps to a baker, and to another shepherd who could read and could tell her exciting stories after all. He probably wasn't the only one, but he was excited and his intuitive understanding of the camel driver's comment. Maybe he was also learning the universal language that deals with the past and the present of all people, hunches. His mother used to call them. The boy was beginning to understand the intuition is really a sudden immersion of the soul into the universal current of life, where the histories of all people are connected, and we are able to know everything because it's all written there. Matub, the boy said, remembering the crystal merchant. The desert was all sand in some stretches and rocky in others. When the caravan was blocked by a boulder, it had to go around it. If there was a large rocky area, they had to make a major detour. If the sand was too fine for the animal's hoof, they sought a way where the sand was more substantial. In some places, the ground was covered with the salt of dried up lakes. The animals barked at such places, and the camel drivers were forced to dismount and unburden their charges. The drivers carried the freight themselves over such treacherous footing and then reloaded the camels. If a guide were to fall ill or die, the camel drivers would draw lots and appoint a new one. But all this happened for one basic reason. No matter how many detours and adjustments it made, the caravan moved toward the same compass point. Once obstacles were overcome, it returned to its course, sighting on a star that indicated the location of the horses. When the people saw that star shining in the morning sky, they knew they were on the right course toward water. palm trees, shelter, and other people. It was only the Englishman who was unaware of all this. He was, for the most part, immersed in reading his books. The boy, too, had his book, and he had tried to read it during the first few days of the journey, but he found it much more interesting to observe the caravan, listen to the wind. As soon as he had learned to know his camel better and to establish a relationship with him, he threw the book away, although the boy had developed a superstition that each time he opened the book he would learn something important. He decided it was an unnecessary burden. He became friendly with the camel driver who traveled alongside him at night. As they sat around the fire, the boy related to the driver his adventure as a shepherd. During one of these conversations, the driver told of his own life. I used to live near Al Haram, he said. I had my orchard, my children, and a life that would change not at all until I died. One year, when the crop was the best ever, we all went to Mecca, and I satisfied the only unmet obligation in my life. I could die happily, and that made me feel good. One day the earth began to tremble, and the Nile overflooded its banks. It was something that I thought could happen only to others, never to me. My neighbors feared they would lose all their olive trees in the flood, and my wife was afraid that we would lose our children. I thought that everything I owned would be destroyed. The land was ruined, and I had to find some other way to earn a living. So now I am a camel rider. But that disaster taught me to understand the word of Allah. People need not fear the unknown if they are capable of achieving what they need and want. We are afraid of losing what we have, whether it's our life or our possessions or property. But this fear evaporates when we understand that our life stories and the history of the world were written by the same hand. Sometimes their caravan met with another, one always had something that the other needed. As if everything were indeed written by one hand, as they sat around the fire, the camel driver exchanged information about windstorms and told stories about the deserts. At other times, mysterious hooded men would appear. They were Bedouins who did surveillance along the caravan route. They provided warnings about thieves and barbarian tribes. They came in silence and departed the same way, dressed in black garments that showed only their eyes. One night, a camel driver came to the fire where the Englishman and the boy were sitting. There are rumors of tribal war, he told them. The three fell silent. The boy noted that there was a sense of fear in the air, even though no one said anything. Once again, he was experiencing the language without words, a universal language. The Englishman asked if they were in danger. Once you get into the desert, there is no going back, said the camel driver. And when you can't go back, you have to worry only about the best way of moving forward. The rest is up to Allah, including the danger. And he concluded by saying the mysterious word, Maktub. You should pay more attention to the caravan, the boy said to the Englishman after the camel driver had left. We make a lot of detours, but we're always heading for the same destination. And you ought to read more about the world, answered the Englishman. Books are like caravans in that respect. The immense collection of people and animals began to travel faster. The days had always been silent, but now even the nights, when the travelers were accustomed to talking around the fires, had also become quiet. And one day the leader of the caravan made the decision that the fires should no longer be lightened, so as not to attract attention to the caravan. The travelers adopted the practice of arranging the animals in a circle at night, sleeping together in the center as protection against the nocturnal cold, and the leader posted armed sentinels at the fringes of the group. The Englishman was unable to sleep one night. He called to the boy, and they took a walk along the dunes surrounding the encampment. There was a full moon, and the boy told the Englishman the story of his life. The Englishman was fascinated with the part about the progress achieved at the crystal shop after the boy began working there.